1 second. And you are live.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from today, to our European Customer Experience Organisation's Economics of Empathy. Why Customer, Employee and AI Centricity Pays, with Dr. Natalie Petouhoff, author of Empathy in Action. And you can see I have my book and all of my post-its here, so it is a very well read book. My name is Emma Sutton. I am one of the ECXO ambassadors, and I have been delivering customer first strategies now for way over 2 decades, but that is showing a little bit of my age. And I work within Oracle's Global Customer Success Organization. I have truly honored today to have been asked to facilitate this conversation with Dr. Natalie. And joining me in the background is Ricardo Salzgulko, MD and founding member of the ECXO, who will be assisting us today with your questions. So as you are seeing the presentation today, please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the chat at any time. Just a little bit about the ECXO. We are an independent non-profit business network for CX professionals, and we are dedicated to developing a CX maturity model for Europe and beyond. Our objective is to educate corporations and collaborate with brands through impactful and valuable, and more so than that, but practical events, research and discussion forums that help and challenge, improve and validate the status quo across Europe to ensure that we get better together. So, Dr. Natalie, we are so excited to have you with us today. Rather than do an introduction for you, I am going to hand straight over to you to give a short introduction, and then feel free to go direct into your presentation. And then I'm sure we will have plenty of time for questions from both myself and the audience when you've finished.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you. Really honored to be here. And I've been implementing technology since, well, it feels like the beginning of time. I wasn't there when fire was invented, but it feels a little bit like that. And through all these years, CRM, ERP, cloud, social, digital, I've made some observations. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about, is what is going to make your AI implementation, in particular in customer service and customer experience, better. So the concept is kind of like peanut butter and chocolate. It's AI and empathy. They're actually better together. And it's the topic of my new book. I just talked to my publisher yesterday, and he is very excited. We're excited to announce that it will be coming out March of 2025. And we'll touch on a lot of the topics that we see here today. And if you have a little plug, if you do have a case study that you'd like to be included in the book, please reach out. All right, so let's get started here. So since the beginning of time, our lives have been at the effect of the exponential change in technology. And currently, we're in the 5th industrial revolution, where there is the possibility for deep multi-level collaboration between people and machines and awareness. But because humans are involved, we are in a hype cycle. So this is a curve that Gartner analysts developed back in 1995. And what you see here is that with every technology cycle, there's a hype cycle. And so you see, like, there's nothing, it seems like nothing. And then there's like, everybody's talking about it, right? And then what happens afterwards is we go back into this trough of disillusionment. And part of the reason for this cycle is because in the beginning, everyone's really excited, but it actually takes organizations a minute to be able to figure out, more than a minute, to figure out, how do we take this and how do we ingest it? How do we actually apply it? So it's where I come into the picture. I'm not a programmer or developer, but I do take the things that have been developed and help companies actually implement it so they can get the return on investment. And so a couple of things that lessons learned that I've learned, one is that what's really key is the idea of organizational change. And I have a whole section on that in the book, but then this concept of empathy. And so let's look at why empathy is so important. So let's say you're going to apply AI to customer service. Well, we all know, right? People say, oh, AI is going to take over the world. Yet, whether it's an IVR or whether it's a chatbot, we're still frustrated by that technology. So we have press 1 for, press 2 for, and that makes customers feel quite frustrated. And the blind spot for companies is they think they're just going to find more customers. The research shows, however, while 80% of executives believe they provide an amazing experience, only 8% of customers agree. And part of that is because we programmed our bots and our agents with what I call sympathy scripts. I'm so sorry that's happening to you. I know how disappointing this is. I'd be disappointed too. And so we're the way that contact centers have been around about 70 years, and the way that we're really structuring this is that we approach it with sympathy. And it partially worked in the old days, but it doesn't really work today. And in fact, the studies, the work I've done with DoorDash, the work I'm doing with Hilton, what we find is they actually make experiences worse, and it makes the customer more frustrated and escalates those particular interactions. So now let's look at, let's say we're going to apply AI to the employee experience. This could be like WFM. It could be all kinds of things. So this is a typical thing that happens. We're sitting around the table and a boss says something, or maybe they don't say it out loud, but they kind of mean it. Before we start this round of brainstorming, I'd just like to remind you that all the ideas that are not mine will be rejected. So this is what we call classic NIH, or not invented here. And the idea behind this is that it makes employees feel like they're not valued, they're frustrated. And so when we look at the results of that kind of management style and behavior, Gallup says that 77% of the employees are quiet quitting. So for every dollar that you're spending on employment, you're getting 23 cents of value. 50% of those employees have one foot out the door, meaning they're interviewing because they're looking for the next thing. But what's fascinating is that 77%, they know what they'd like to see changed. But the question is, are organizations really prepared to do that? And the idea behind empathy is to make employees, there's all this, we're going to get these productivity increases, that's going to be amazing. And AI can do that. What's fascinating is sometimes we don't slow down to go fast. We don't ask employees what gets in their way of their productivity, where the friction and the frustration is. But they're the ones that actually know what's really frustrating and where those efficiencies can occur. And by asking them, we also get their buy-in. So for these reasons, AI is not a technology IT project. It's really everyone's responsibility in the organization. So before you start to implement technology, right, there's some things that you have to kind of know what's going on in the zeitgeist, what's happening with your customers and with your employees. And what I'm finding as I work with brands is that the atmosphere and what people's expectations of, thank you, that I don't know if you guys heard that noise, but I'm really glad it's gone. Thank you. So it's always mattered, right, how customers and employees feel, but today it's even more important to look at this. So when people said, well, why, what changed? And so what I think happened is during the pandemic, nobody really knew what was going to happen. It kind of felt like the end of the world. And so it gave us a cause for pause. And in those really quiet moments, what we found was that we asked ourselves really big questions about what we wanted for our life, what we wanted for work. And so the set of expectations that you're now implementing into, that's why we see some of the statistics from Bain, from Gallup. And so we really have a different atmosphere. And so if you look at the very large implementations back when we started with CRM and ERP, Hershey's, Nike, Waste Management, $500 million projects that just went upside down because we really weren't prepared to integrate the people part. And what's important about AI is that the technology is changing really, really fast. And so while we've ignored the people part of business in technology implementations before, think about it. If we do that again, one, we know that doesn't work. And two, AI is changing so quickly, we're really going to do the wrong things faster. So one of the statistics I thought was fascinating, because some people are like, well, just get on the bus or the bus is going to run over you kind of mentality. But I think there's a cost that organizations aren't seeing. And according to Gallup and Bain and McKinsey, what they're saying is that employee disengagement can cost a mid-sized company between $200,000 and $300,000 in lost productivity. So it is really key. It is really important that we start to look at this, because the very foundation of how businesses are conducted and what's important has really truly changed. So we know customers are frustrated, employees are disenchanted, businesses are struggling. I still see a whole lot of layoffs. Layoffs are an um, interesting strategy for l- trying to make your company look like it's very productive. But I'm going to talk about another opportunity that I see, and I think that the reason that we go to layoffs as a cost-cutting revenue strategy is that we have a blind spot. And so the concept here is that when you're traveling 60 miles an hour, a blind spot can be very dangerous and it can put a lot at risk. But what if there was something that you could see that you hadn't seen before? The question is, how valuable would that be to you? So one of the biggest blind spots that I see as I work with organizations is that companies are not using empathy as a business strategy. And what that means is the culture is void of empathy. So leaders, and it's not, I want to kind of caveat this. We're not talking about pizza parties. We're not talking about being overly nice. We are talking about the idea of gathering the feedback from your customers and your employees. And the reason that that's so important is because when we don't do that, we miss the perspective of the very people, the employees and the customers who know what's not working. And so that means that leaders miss essential facts that lead to the blind spots. So they don't fix the things that are really wrong because they're missing the root cause. And empathy is that ability to sit in the seat of your customers and your employees, get that feedback. And that feedback is truly the canary in the coal mine and the golden nuggets that are required for competitive differentiation. And so that's why AI cannot start with the tech. It needs to start with the strategy. What exactly are we doing and why are we doing it? It goes back to basics, right? I know that there's a lot of hype around AI, but I think I have this philosophy about slow down to go fast. And I think it's really important that we slow down a minute, figure out our strategy, figure out what we want the technology to do, and then embark on those next steps. So the idea here is let's look at the spectrum of AI technologies as well as empathy as a business strategy, because what we want to do is we want to use technology to become even more customer and employee centric, because that's really where we're going to get the growth in our business. So if we look at some of the spectrum of AI and automation technologies, we can, maybe there's lots of ways to go back, but RPA is one of the first ones. So I thought I'd give a little perspective on how we use it in our personal lives and then in our professional lives. So you might check a bank account balance, you might scan a receipt, or when you're depositing a check. We've used it in payroll, we've used it to onboard our employees, or to sort through customer service requests. Now, I want to break down true AI into three different categories. The first one is predictive AI, and it's the ability to predict the future based on historical data. So in our personal lives, it's kind of like, if you like this, you're going to like that. So think about Amazon or Netflix recommendations, or wearables, which take data and then give you some statistics on your health. In terms of our corporate lives, we've used it for customer service agents to determine the next best action. Sales is using it to analyze and score leads. And maybe we maybe we maybe we are actually using it to optimize electricity production or determine if a person should actually be insured. So there's lots and lots of ways that we've used predictive AI. Now let's look at conversational AI. So conversational AI is the communication between humans and machines, and that ability to respond. So in our personal lives, that could look like Alexa or Siri or Google Assist. It might be a voice-powered AI assistant. And in corporate uses, some examples, Sephora uses a virtual agent to help customers find products, book appointments, and get makeup tips. Starbucks has a virtual assistant as part of their chatbot to take personalized coffee orders. And Whole Foods allows you to talk to a chef, a chef bot. So there's lots of ways that we've used conversational AI. Now let's look at generative AI. And this is the one where all the hype is. So I want to make a distinction here. The way that I'm looking at generative AI is that it's really important to know whether the technology is built on top of a large language model. And that's really the differentiating factor here. So in our personal lives, and one of the things, the turning point. So I spent the last year really digging into AI. I wasn't you always think, okay, well, I finished my degrees and I finished all these courses and I'm done. But the truth is, we're never done. So this past year, I went back to school. I started taking a lot of classes. And I think for me, the turning point was when I sat down with ChatGPT, and the pictures that you see on the left-hand side, the very pretty ones. I can't draw. I'm not an artist. And within I put in a descriptor, the prompt engineering piece, and within 3 seconds, they drew these really amazing pictures based on what I had put in. And I think the brilliance of ChatGPT is that they created a visceral experience of the power of a large language model by allowing us to play with it. So if you haven't done this, and ChatGPT or Perplexity, or there's a whole bunch of different models out there, I would highly suggest that you jump in and you start playing with it, because that is what gave me that visceral experience of what is so amazing. Now, in terms of corporate uses, there's lots of corporate uses. So let's kind of take a look at some of those. So let's say you're in engineering and you have code and it's not quite working. You can put the code in and you can have it spit back some feedback to help you understand what's not really working. Another application is marketing and communications. So let's say that and I want to caveat this too, when you're working in the corporate environment, you do not want to put anything that is really important or proprietary to your company into a public chatbot. You really want to use a walled garden, which basically means your own private instance. Think about it as the same kind of instance that you would have if you were working in the cloud environment. And here you can put in tons of information about your unique selling proposition, your products, your services, all that great data. And then you can ask, hey, I want to write a blog post or communications about a new feature. And you may not get the blog post that you're going to use in the end, but this is where some of the efficiencies come into. And this can also be your answers to your knowledge base, your FAQs, all kinds of things that are really important. But again, we really need to look at that walled garden approach. Let's say you're in finance and words are not the thing that you do, but you're really great at numbers. You can take your F1 document, which is what you use to create when you're doing an IPO, and you can ask it, hey, here's all my data. Can you make a description? And then in an HR application, and this is something that we see in customer service all the time, we're asked very specific questions, right? And then we want that chatbot to give accurate, important information back. And so based on that walled garden scenario in a customer service situation, based on what you've put in, you can get that kind of automated efficiency. And wouldn't it be great if we had chatbots that actually gave customers what they wanted? And I was at Forrester back in the day when we really started to look at self-service, and people were saying, well, people will never call into the contact center. Self-service is going to be it. But the truth is that there was a limitation to the technology. And oftentimes this happens where we have the overpromise and the underdeliver because the technology isn't there. What's great about generative AI, and let's say you were going to do a chatbot with generative, is that most chatbots are based on some sort of rule-based capability. And so you have to program it very specifically with all the different ways that someone might say something. What's great about generative is that because of the way that neural networks work, is that it can inference and with the context that you give it, and the context has to be good. You have to clean up your knowledge base and all your content first. But when you put that context in, then it can make those particular inferences and be able to answer questions and do it very accurately. So I have big hope for generative AI chatbots. I think it would be fantastic. And I think, these are the kinds of strategies, and I hope that technology, that all the vendors that are out there are listening, and that we really look at the application of these technologies, especially in customer service, customer experience, and employee experience. Because at the end of the day, we really want those efficiencies and effectiveness, and we don't want to continue to frustrate customers because that economically really does not make any sense. So, I'm not going to go through this particular slide, but we can make my slides available for everybody. So people have asked me, Dr. Nat, how do I become an empathetic AI leader? It's really pretty simple, but it does take a minute to think about this. So step one is actively listen. Don't listen so that you can figure out the next sentence that you're going to say. And as you're speaking to someone, say, tell me more. I'd like to understand your perspective on that. And step three is that when you get that information in, integrate that feedback into your decisions. And so an example of that, of what I'm doing right now with Hilton, is that we're looking at transforming their customer experiences in chat and email and phone. And we're talking to the agents, we're talking to the supervisors, we're talking to the team, we're talking to customers. And every time we have the next meeting, we find out fascinating nuggets of gold and perspectives that we didn't know. And so, as an empathy practitioner, what's really key is to actively listen, say, tell me more. And now we're integrating that feedback into our decisions. I think the next wave of exponential change will come from the application of all these technologies, in particular generative and quantum computing. And I want to just talk about one company that I worked with. So their strategy in the very beginning was they said, Dr. Nat, can we work with you? And this was about a year ago. And I said, yes, I'd love to work with you, but I'd like you to think about not laying anybody off. And so I kind of saw the wheels turning, right? And I felt like their thoughts were, but isn't that part of this? Like everybody's in the layoff, cost-cutting strategy mode. And I said, well, hear me out. So kind of here's a short story about what happened, and you'll see more of this in my next book. We made a commitment to not lay anybody off. We decided for a year we would give everyone the opportunity to upscale, cross skill, like really figure out what they wanted to do with their careers, which when you go to human capital, the person, the CHRO, that requires something more of them. And it also requires not only positional power, but budget and resources to be able to figure out what everybody's currently doing so that you can figure out what you want them to do in the future with this new technology. So we went to the employees, we went and we asked them, where's your friction? What doesn't work? They told us. Part of that is a really great organizational change because it helps people get on board and not feel so threatened. And you get the information, those either the canary in the coal mine moments or those golden nuggets. So we took that and then we went and we said, okay, so let's change those things. That's where our starting line is, and there'll be new things in the future. Then we went to talk to said what doesn't work, and there were the obvious ones, the press one for the chatbots, and we started to fix those. And what we found was the employees did get between 15 and 50% efficiencies. And instead of saying, okay, well, let's just wipe some people off the books, right? Let's just do this cost cutting thing. Let's take that extra time and let's talk about all the things that you wanted to do in the past 10 years or 5 years that you couldn't do because you didn't have enough people or enough time. And let's innovate and really transform your products and services. So we did that. And what was fantastic about that was that a year later, by really improving the customer experience, by giving employees the ability to co-create their future, we were able to create products and services that are truly a competitive differentiator, and they are now a year ahead of their competitors. So with that, Emma, I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you. That is so insightful. And I've got little post-its with so many questions sort of around. And as I've been listening, you talk, and I found myself smiling quite a lot through that, because the fear factor for me always comes into this. When you start talking about not just sort of AI, but automation, digital transformation, it's this fear factor that very often the impact is felt greatest in some of the sort of frontline areas. And I'm going to ask you the question without trying to answer it also myself, but there is this, when we started on our journey, which wasn't that long ago, I'm sure, of sort of customer experience, you know, we're probably looking at it. You talk about sort of the era stage, and lots of our jobs didn't exist 20 years ago. You know, the role of the chief customer officer, the chief experience officer, head of design, head of experience, you know, it was that sort of early 2000s, wasn't it? Way sort of just before sort of the iPhone came out, and that fear of losing my job. And yet surely the roles are just different. Can you explain a little bit more where you have seen that? You said about the upskilling. Where have you seen it work really well?
So there's all kinds of headlines, and I want to encourage people that are doing the hype stuff to stop. Just stop, right? Because what it does is it creates fear and uncertainty and panic. And I think that's part of where this mentality of laying everybody off comes from. At the end of the day, we still need humans, right? So somebody has to put the prompt, which is like the request, into the machine. The machine just doesn't spontaneously generate. And yes, there are people who are projecting that someday the machines will take over. Great. I can't comment on that. But right now, this is where we are. So I don't think that we're going to lose our jobs to AI, at least in the next 25 years. We are going to lose our jobs to people who know how to use AI in their work. So that's why, as part of what I'm talking about, is I would implore you to understand what this is, to study. I mean, I write a lot about it. There's lots of other peers that do newsletters. Like, you really need to carve out some time to understand this, and then get on a large language model, whether, pick one, right? It doesn't matter which one, but just play with it. Because in that, you're going to start to understand that it's not so scary. It's actually pretty cool. And I think, so one of the things I remember is my aunt. She was a secretary. She worked for American Airlines. And so she went through the paper to word processor, or typewriter to word processor to computers. And I watched her as her job got outsourced, right? It got outsourced to technology. What she did, as she could see this coming, and I have to give her a lot of credit because I think some of my forward thinking comes from her. She started taking classes at night so that she reskilled herself. Companies really weren't really necessarily thinking about reskilling and upskilling. So what I think is that, as you think about technology, and one of the reasons I put that curve there is that work does change. Experiences do change. And so if you don't want to be outsourced, then it's up to you to educate yourself. If you happen to work for an employer that's got your back and really forward thinking about this, they will be helping you to do that.
And if I could just stick on that sort of that vulnerability side and the educational side. And we were chatting a little bit a couple of days ago about certainly post the pandemic. And I don't know whether, and I'd love your views of what you've seen, but I've certainly seen an almost a mass exodus of experience in the boardroom, perhaps earlier than they may have intended because of lifestyle choices, and in that probably people being promoted slightly earlier also. And we talk about bringing your authentic self to work all the time. So, we talk about that in creating a culture, but also in the empathy environment. How can we sort of encourage those people that are sitting around the boardroom? How can the audience today actually help educate and encourage that vulnerability of asking for help? Because you have spent so much time learning, and we're all having to do it. And this certainly isn't a bury your head in the sand, because you'll just surround yourselves with people that can. So how can this audience encourage their leaders to show their own vulnerability?
It's an interesting question. It's a very large organizational change problem, right? So we can talk about bringing our authentic self to work. We can talk about being authentic as leaders, but we're actually in a paradigm of that's not really how things are done here. So can you really affect change? I think that we can only affect changes around us by being different ourselves and having people experience it differently. Part of the reason that I'm really focusing on the ROI of the economics of empathy is that when people feel valued, when they feel, that they really truly matter, their dedication, their motivation, their innovation changes. And so part of the reason I quoted the work from Gallup is because when we don't lead like this, you are actually costing your organization a lot of money. So let's go back to 77% of people are quiet quitting, which means they go to work, but they don't really put the time and energy in. So as an employer, as a board of directors or a CX leader, are you okay with paying $1 for salaries, but getting 23 cents of return? If you're okay with that and you want to run your company that way, I will say at some point that's really going to hurt you. So part of what I'm looking for is how are people explaining this to their organizations, right? So my way of doing it is talking about the impact, the personal impact, the professional impact, the impact on the things that we say we want, which are efficiency and effectiveness and productivity and motivation and innovation. So if we say that those values and those outcomes are important, yet we're setting up situations in the work world where those things cannot happen, then that's in conflict. So that's when leaders really need to hear this message and to decide and to make a change. So I think I also call it a reference point gap. So when I talk about this stuff, what I see is a flicker of hope, and people are like, oh my God, that's a great idea. And then it kind of loses some of its spark. And so that's because we don't have a reference point for it to stick. And so the more of us that are talking about this, the more of us that are living by example, the clearer and clearer this paradigm shift is going to be. It takes a village. It's going to take all of us to really change.
It does. And when we have these sessions and these audiences, in the main, the people that are sitting listening to us today already get it. A lot of people really struggle you talk about the ROI, which I think the sooner everybody can have something to hold on to and say, this is what proves it. Because we talk about empathy, and it's also a lot about your gut feel, isn't it? The passion and the purpose for the people that are driving this forward in the organization are sometimes not the people at the boardroom table. And these roles that whether it's, we want a customer experience lead or chief customer officer, they very often are reporting. They're not always at the boardroom table. They may be one or two down. So they're already within a silo. I promised the audience today some real practical help. Can you give this audience just one or two nuggets of how can they really bring this to life in the boardroom and influence people, not just at the side of them, but sat above them in what can be sometimes quite hierarchical organizations? I'm sorry to put you on the spot there,
No,
some practical advice. Thank you.
you're welcome. So I think, first of all, it starts with us. So we have to decide that we feel comfortable, like we truly believe in this, right? So think about any initiative that you have put forth to the people that you work for, your bosses, there, and then they are going to take that message up the chain to the board and to the CXO suite. So when I've been faced with developing new ideas, part of what I've done is actually figure out what they care about, right? And what they care about at the board level is shareholder value. They care about, if it's a public company, could be stock value, brand reputation, competitive differentiation, new market growth, deal size, all of those things. So part of this, as you're talking to people that are above you that may not get the conversation, is really learning, how do we reframe this so that we're speaking in their language? Because if we just approach it as empathy and it's going to be so great, what they hear is kumbaya factories. And I can tell you, working with executives, and it's not until they have an experience of what the difference is. Like a lot of people read my book and they're like, oh yeah, we're doing that. And I'm like, okay, but you're not. I can guarantee you're not. And then when I start to work with them and go into their organizations and we start to apply the process, they're like, oh,
Those
yeah.
light bulb moments, isn't it?
It's the light bulb
But
moments.
they're the nuggets, aren't they? Because you know that you can move forward.
Right. You have their buy-in, they see the distinctions. It is really different. So part of it is, I would say, what's really important is to build that business case. So I have created initiatives my whole life where people thought they were soft, but they're not, right? They really do impact the bottom line. So part of it is starting out with measurements. And part of it is, what is that current state? So every time I go into an organization to help them, we look at what the current state is, and we measure that picture real time. And then we look at, what is it that we're going to change? And then we start to see what exactly would help those changes get better. And then we measure 2 months, 6 months, a year into it. And it's really building these business cases to be able to say, when this is where we were, this is what we changed in the customer and the employee experience. And as a result, when I was working with the food service delivery, we saved $100 million.
Wow.
We increased revenue by $10 million. Right? So it's those kinds of things that are measurable, right? And part of that was using the concept of the house is on fire. So when someone calls, right, or contacts you, chat, whatever channel it is, and they say, you forgot my fries, you didn't give me my points for my hotel, in their mind, the house is on fire. So instead of answering the question with, oh, I hear you and I'm so sorry, and that must be really frustrating, the response needs to go towards, my house is on fire. The response is, got it. Let me get the hose.
Yes. And is that where, and it might be worth exploring that a little bit, that's where the difference in the empathy and sympathy comes in, isn't it? And you talk in your book about sort of those, and you mentioned it earlier, the sympathy scripts of business silos, of people doing technology led, and here's the script for when this happens, and it's almost a process flow. And in those moments that matter, it's not a script of, I'm sure you don't want to, I'm sure that's not great, and I feel for you. And you need to feel it, don't you?
So part of what so we've overly scripted our agents and our chatbots with sympathy scripts, where it merely makes a difference. And so you're asking me, like, how do I get executives to understand this? Is take a look at your scripts, figure out where you can take some of that sympathy stuff out, measure the average handle time before and after, and measure the CSAT scores. Because what I'm asking you to do is to collect that data to show that this works. And then what we find is when you use the sympathy scripts, we've always thought that that's more polite or nice, but it actually, especially today, incites customers to get really, really frustrated. And what we found was when we took that out, it really didn't change the interaction from a quality standpoint. What it did do is have the customer feel heard and seen and acknowledged. And they felt like, okay, you got my back, you understand it, and you're going to help me. So I don't have to go into some long story and get mad at the customer agent or scream at the chatbot, which only makes the NLP go worse. And so in that, what we found was by doing that, it reduced the average handle time in half.
Wow.
And this is not like, this is the key, Emma, is that when you start with empathy, when you start with the customer and employee feedback, you're going to take out things that don't work in your organization. And then you can apply AI, right? So if we applied AI to sympathy scripts, it would just do the wrong things faster. It would really be a mess, right?
And how have you seen sort of the risk factor? Because there will be certain industries that are a little bit more risk averse, and where people would see it as risky because having a set script and a consistent script on all these is safe. And it's almost by encouraging people to show empathy. Is there an unwritten rule there to say we are giving you the autonomy to do the right thing? You know, whilst we're talking whether it's internal or external. So are there certain industries that are more risk averse? Are they seeing different results? Or is it actually more of a risk to not show it?
So scripts are a fascinating topic, right? So we've overly scripted our agents and our bots. What we're doing here is we're teaching process. So the process is the house is on fire process. If someone says, no matter what they say, your response needs to come from, I'll get the hose. So it's not that we're not using scripts, but we're cutting out the stuff that we're cutting out the sympathy, which is what incites more anger. And we're giving agents a new language in order to say, I got your back. So every time I work with a company, that actual language is a language that we develop together, and it's a little bit different. So it's not that there isn't any script at all. We're not completely free flowing improv, right? So I would say don't get scared to think that people are just have, complete, like they'll just make it up on the fly. Because when I was working with the food service delivery, we're working with, I think, 8 different BPOs, 15,000 customer service agents across 31 countries. That's a lot of people to go in a particular direction and get it right, and consistently get it right where we could see that reduction in average handle time. So what we're really looking at is a new way to interact, more authentic, genuine. So it comes from that strategy. And then people say, so once the agents and the supervisors, everybody gets it, then they're like, okay, what does good look like?
Yes.
What is it that you want me to say? So then that next step is, how do we define what good looks like? And for every single company, that's going to be a little bit different. So if you're in a regulated industry, that might be a little bit different than, like a food service delivery industry. And I think that there's a bit of tailoring, but the principle, the strategy doesn't change.
Yeah, no, that's really important to it's almost keeping your eye. That's the North Star, isn't it? I've got another couple of questions for myself, but I'm just encouraging people, if you do have some more questions, please keep them coming in. Natalie, your background was always fascinating to me, and how you ended up in this role. And we keep talking about sort of why does it matter, and you've got a great example of that automotive kind of, that why does it matter of the story to help bring that to life.
So I think that probably the most prominent example of why empathy matters is when Edward Deming went to the American auto industry, and he wanted to say, and back then it was called quality, right? So the name of what we're talking about, it's changed a little bit over time, but the principles stay the same. And he said, let's listen to our customers, let's listen to our employees, let's really see how this is going to make a difference. And at the time, they really weren't interested. And he was invited by the Japanese auto market to come there and to really transform that marketplace. And so if you want a North Star, right, I'm still collecting data, I'm still building my economic model with great results. But if you want to look historically at someone who has really did this, the truth is that by listening to customers and employees, the Japanese auto market became very dominant, and the American auto market has never recovered. So as a historical point in time, that's the best example. I mean, even in my own personal career, and I think, Emma, that's what you were kind of talking about, is I'm there, brand new, just out of the University of Michigan, very excited about my job, feeling a little bit vulnerable. And what was fascinating was I got asked, I'm a material science engineer. And so they asked me about corrosion, and we were doing two-sided galvanizing. And they wanted to know, can we continue to do that, or could we cut costs by reducing the amount of galvanizing, just do one side? So I said, well, just off of the top of my head, I'm going to tell you that my gut says we shouldn't do that. We do that for a reason. They go, well, just do the tests, right? So I did the tests. And what was fascinating was it came back that the panels corroded exponentially faster. So I showed them the data and all the charts and the ROI and all those calculations. And they go, okay, well, thank you very much. And I said, oh, well, before you go, because they're picking up all their binders and everything. And I said, I'm just curious what decision we're making, right? Because I felt very invested in this. And they go, well, we're going to do one-sided. And I was horrified, because as an engineer, there's structural integrity, there's product, just like you don't really want, I lived in Detroit at the time, you don't want your cars, the brand that you work for, having cars with holes in the sides. It's like you want to be proud of where you work. And so I felt like I was at this pinnacle of a really big decision. And they said to me, well, you're not in marketing. Why do you care? And I was stunned. And I said, but I am in engineering, and you asked me an engineering question. And my response was, why don't you care? And so that was a very early experience that I had as a young engineer. And I was really trying to figure out, how come decisions get made like this? And oftentimes I think decisions get made based on short-term economics. And so when we start to really look at what is the long-term effect on our brand and what customers feel about us, it really implores us to change the way that we're making decisions. Now, if you look at, Milton Friedman in the 1970s promoted the idea of shareholder value as the number one reason that companies exist. Roger Martin, however, more recently wrote a book, and he talked about the idea that the economics of the decision-making is really, need to be in service of two things, the employees and the customers. And so when I look at the economic model, you really have two assets. You have employees, without which, if they're not there or they're not really participating, you can't create new products and services. And without customers, there's no one to buy. And yet we don't value their experiences. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking about, we have these two assets, how are we empowering them to then empower the economics of the business, right? And sometimes people misconstrue what I'm saying as let's just be really nice to our employees and our customers. there is an agenda to this, right? And I think for the first time in business, this particular economic theory that I'm developing is the idea that when we do the right thing by our customers and by our employees, guess what? It also has that positive exponential effect on business success. And before, when we look at efficiency and effectiveness from the business, short term, it makes sense. But short term, because we get, we lay off people and then our bottom line looks better because we have less expenses and more revenue. But when we look at it long term, it doesn't make sense, right? Because we're cut. There's only so much that you can cut out of a business, and then you're not growing, you're not innovating, you're not driving new revenue, you're not driving new marketplaces. And so part of, I think, this new economic model is to really look at thinking about a longer term model, not just a short term model, but a long term model in terms of not quarter to quarter. And there are a lot of, what I would say is there are a lot of factors when you are on a board and when you're at the CXO level. There is a lot of pressure to make those numbers look good during the quarter and at the end of each quarter. And their bonuses are dependent on that. And so if we really start to think about, and maybe this isn't a skunk works, maybe it's a smaller project. If you start to think about within your organization, trying this as an experiment to show when we do this, right, we start to get these so that you can then help the organization start to extrapolate that this is going to be a really great way to go. And it's not an easy task for those of us who understand this conversation and to be able to sell it up to the chain of command. I mean, I feel really fortunate that the brands that I get to work with and the vendors that I get to work with, they do understand this conversation. So part of it is, where do we want to work? Who do we want to work for?
Yeah, and it's really because by the mere nature that you've been invited in to work with these companies, you already have that champion, and that's where I think sometimes it's quite difficult when you're trying to lead this, whether it's leading with empathy or whether it's from the custom within the heart of what you're doing. It can feel alien and it can feel quite a lonely kind of role, can't it, when you're constantly trying to champion this approach, which sort of, where do you think, for the people that are watching this and as leaders, how can we show it and be it? Sort of, it's that every day, isn't it? It's almost your own personal brand, but how can we show it?
So again, I go back to deciding that this is a conversation that resonates with you, that it makes sense, that the inferences that I'm talking about in terms of the case studies, you go, okay, that makes sense. Now I really want to learn this. I really want to understand it, right? And then thinking about going into your organization and figuring out, where could we do an experiment, right? Where could we actually look at average handle time? And maybe it's one particular contact center, maybe it's one line of business, and figuring out. And I think that anytime, if this conversation appeals to you, I would say you're a change agent, right? And you really do want to make change. So now you have to look for other people who can hear the conversation, other change agents. And I would say whether it's a CXO level suite or a board, my experience has been there's at least one person, maybe two, who can hear this conversation. And so you want to start to align yourself with other champions. Because if you think about Geoffrey Moore's technology adoption curve, this is, we could call it the empathy ROI AI adoption curve. The innovators and early adopters, which I think this audience is made up of, we get it, right? And then there's a chasm, and there's the rest of the organization, the early adopters and the late adopters, and then the laggards we're never going to reach. So we have to find other people that are above us that can hear the conversation, that are interested in taking a risk and interested in doing things differently. And aligning yourself with those people is really key. And then carving out a small experiment, carving out a skunk works to say, okay, there's a really cool economic theory, and we know that it's really important to start to figure out how do we do this differently, and let's set up an experiment. And let's just sit down. I mean, we could even start with just pull your transcripts from your phone or chat or SMS and look at how many times, just run a query, how many times we're saying I'm sorry.
Yes, that's so true. And you talked a little bit about sort of, and I was jotting notes there of it's almost finding anything else. If you're making white goods, if you're in manufacturing, you do a pilot. If you feel that you need to, if you don't have your CEO that's saying this is how we're going to do business now, and you're either on the bus with us or you're not, and change is fine. But with anything else, so there is that, go and find your champion, isn't it? Find your champion somewhere in the business that will support what you're trying to do, and just see if you can do it, and then prove it. The proof is always in your results. And I read something earlier, there was a CEO of a financial services organization, and he said a great quote. He said, somebody was asking him how you make this happen. He said, because every time I enter the boardroom, I don't enter as the CEO, I enter as the customer. And it helps bring,
Wow.
isn't it? It's really
Yes.
strong, isn't it? Now, and people sometimes used to laugh at me because I used to walk around with shoes and just pop them in the middle of the table just to bring it to life and to help people with, as you said, the light bulb moments earlier. I'm very conscious that we are coming up to the top of the hour. I've got one last question from me, and then I'm going to ask you a question sort of just to close off. Are there regional nuances, do you think, or is it consistent?
Absolutely. Right? Business is personal, and there are regional differences. The book came out a year ago or 2 years ago, and I'm still explaining the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? And when I was working with a food service delivery company, we were working with BPOs that were in Latin America, in Mexico, and so the knee-jerk reaction, right, to this was, oh, you're just using a North American definition of empathy, and our culture is very different, and we like saying I'm sorry. So that's where the house is on, like, we would feel bad if we didn't say I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I'm like, okay, got it. So that's where the house is on fire theory came up from, which is, if your house is on fire, would you want someone to say, oh, I'm so sorry that's happening to you. I know this is really frustrating. I would be frustrated too. Or do you want to hear, got it? I'll get the hose. I have your back. And so it's that, right? We're talking about a paradigm shift. So this is a new way to think. And so in every country, in every culture, there's a bit of a difference. So I gave one talk, and they saw me talk, and I said something about, like, take out the sympathy scripts. So this guy writes me on LinkedIn. He goes, I just showed this to my head of customer experience, and we took them all out. And I'm like, okay, I really wish you would have come to me first, because there are times when, so for the food service delivery, let's say that you're someone who's delivering the food and you get bit by a dog, and you contact the company to say, I can't complete my delivery. Do we first say, I'll get the hose? Or do we say, do you need help? Should I call an ambulance?
Mhm.
So I wouldn't say that there's like a blanket way to do this. So in that particular example, there's the urgency and the severity of what needs to be happened. So it doesn't mean just take out all the I'm sorries. It does mean change the way that we're responding. And then depending on your country, depending on your culture, we do have to look at those nuances. What I'm looking for, and for help globally, is how do we translate the idea that empathy is getting feedback to your two most important assets, your customers and employees? How do we make that the norm?
So you mentioned then about you wish somebody had contacted you at that point, which is a great way to end our conversation. How can people find you?
Probably the best place is LinkedIn. My LinkedIn, Dr. Natalie Petouhoff on LinkedIn. I would say that's the best place. That's where I publish mostly. I'm still doing my blog, but that's the best place. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you. there are some questions that we didn't get to, so I'm hoping that we can still share them with you, Dr. Natalie, after the event, and maybe we can then do a communication back out to this audience. But a huge thank you for you, to you, and for your time today and sharing such great insight and practical help. For the audience, we hope that the conversation has inspired you and also helped you to be able to go back with some practical ideas. And please follow us for our next executive sessions, which is on AI digital conversations, which is very topical again at the moment, and that will feature Paolo Fabrizio, which is on the 24th of April, if my memory serves me right. So thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Dr. Nat, for everything. Have
just one observation. Sorry to interrupt you, Emma. I wrote the wrong thing there. Is the next conversation with Lynn. I forgot. It's about CX ROI, but I was thinking about Fabrizio already. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you and all the audience that was here with us. Thanks a lot for your time.
You're very welcome. And if you have questions, I would love to hear from people, Emma. I would love to hear what resonated, what's your but kind of conversation. Like, what are the questions? Because I'm looking for feedback. I'm looking to improve. So what is it that I didn't say or that you would like to know more about that I can help you in your journey towards making this possible happen?
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.